This episode is brought to you by Maybelline Brave Together, a global initiative dedicated to destigmatizing anxiety and depression and making support accessible to everyone. Need to talk? Connect with a trained counselor by texting TOGETHER to 741-741 or head online to the Brave Together website and access resources and support tools designed to help navigate everything from spotting the signs to how to practice self-care. Find support at Maybelline.com/bravetogether.
Empire. To train best, you have to be mentally prepared.
You know, maybe you're in physically good shape, your HRV, your resting heart rate, your sleep is all great, but maybe you have a decline in your cognitive fatigue due to stress, work-life balance, whatever the situation may be. Maybe you're a little more emotional as well. We're going to pick up on that.
That's Sachs, CEO of Rewire Fitness, who's helping athletes of all levels overcome the mental barriers to great health. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein. In his background, Sachs will talk about his athletic accomplishments and the mental hurdles that held him back from his ultimate goals. It's the basis of the idea to rewire the brain for mental sharpness, focus, and ability to achieve physical goals. The big question for him and anyone who is in this space, however, is to prove out the ability to engineer positive outcomes when it comes to brain activity. Our guest this week is Sachs, who is the CEO of Rewire Fitness, which is a human performance company that provides evidence-based solutions in mental fitness, holistic readiness tracking, and mind and body recovery. So let's talk physical and mental readiness when training. Hey, Son, how are you? Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Really excited to have a conversation.
Tell me a little bit about your company, Rewire Fitness. Obviously, that was word soup. Can you kind of, in layman's terms, tell us what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a mental fitness app, which is a pretty new and emerging term, but it's really designed to help athletes improve their mindset, their readiness to perform, and their resilience. And it's all really based on this common knowledge that we all have. You know, when we talk to an athlete at any level, from a weekend warrior to a professional, we'll ask them, you know, what percentage of your performance is mental? And they'll typically say somewhere between 50 and 95%, depending on the sport, the athlete, and so on. And then we'll do a follow-up question. You know, that makes sense. Let's say it's 75% of your performance. How much time do you spend on it? You know, and that's where, unfortunately, there's sort of an awkward silence because, and it's really not their fault. You know, if we think about training the body, you know, there's a structured way to train your body. But up until Rewire, there hasn't been a structured way to train your mind. And that's really sort of the solution that we're providing to help athletes be the best they can be. Okay,
let me ask this question. When you ask an athlete how much of it is mental and they give you a percentage, how do they know what the answer to that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that intuitively athletes understand. The mental game is important. And why? You know, when they're out training, they'll get to a point where their mind and body will start to fatigue. And the only thing that's keeping them going is their mind. So it's one of those things where, depending on the individual, you know, they'll recognize that deficit or they'll recognize that challenge. And it's a pretty obvious sort of self-evident thing. Now, it can certainly be measured in the lab, and we work with scientists very closely in building the product. But that's just, you know, it's one of those things. If you're an athlete at any level, you've run into that sort of headwind of your mind really not being able to rise to the challenge or sort of getting overwhelmed.
Okay, so when I said the line holistic readiness tracking, what does that mean?
Yes, that's a great question. So first off, the sort of broader context, you know, athletes, a lot of athletes, maybe not everyone, but many use some kind of wearable or multiple wearables. For example, for me, I had my Oura Ring on last night. I was tracking my sleep. I got up in the morning. I went for a walk. I was tracking my steps. I had my Apple Watch on. I had a heart rate monitor. I posted to Strava several times already this morning. You get the idea. There's all this data, but making sense of what it means holistically is our mission. Now, the other piece of holistic is we're not just thinking about the physical part. We're not just the sum of our sleep and heart rate data. We're actually much more complex than that. So what our system does is it will take in all that wearable data, make sense of it for you. And as a morning practice, you wake up in the morning, spend 90 seconds with us. What we'll do is we'll assess your physical state from all of that data. We'll also do a cognitive test where we understand your cognitive performance compared to your baseline. And we'll also measure your emotional state. And so that sort of holistic picture of your physical, your cognitive, and your emotional goes into an overall score. And then we break it down for you so you know where you're at. Like maybe you had a bad night's sleep. It's negatively impacting your cognitive performance. That's a really good thing to know, whether you're going to perform that day or you just have a busy schedule where you need to perform on some, maybe non-physical level.
Interesting. Are you seeing a great variance day to day or week to week in cognitive function?
Yeah. So, this is another blind spot. We talk to so many athletes and work with a variety of levels of athletes. And even at the professional level, what happens is, you're physically pushing your body incredibly hard, but then there's other stressors in life that are impacting your cognitive fatigue. And the cognitive and physical performance are very tightly connected. So in other words, if you're under a lot of cognitive stress, it's going to negatively impact your physical performance. What we see in terms of variance, you may be 5%, 10% off your baseline. What that means specifically is your ability to focus will be reduced, your reaction time in many different types of situations, whether it be in sport or, driving down the road. All of those things are going to be compromised. And in addition to that, because you're going to be under a greater amount of cognitive fatigue, even 5%, you may have more emotionality. You have less what they call a cognitive control, the ability to sort of manage your emotions. All of those things could negatively impact your day and your performance. So we want to let athletes and users know, guess what? Heads up, you have maybe 5-10% off your normal. And that's really important for them to be aware of going into the day.
Okay.
We all have to perform at some level.
And then, so what do I do about that? Knowing that information, what can I even do about it?
Exactly. That's the other part of our solution. So, a lot of times what we'll see is sort of a readiness diagnosis without an intervention. So what our solution is really focused on doing is, one, identifying the problem, sort of illuminating that so you understand where you're at with very specific measures. And then we create our algorithm will basically create a recovery protocol to help you make the best of your day, depending on your areas of need and your goals. So for example, let's say, maybe you're in physically good shape, your HRV, your resting heart rate, your sleep is all great. But maybe you have a decline in your cognitive fatigue due to stress, work-life balance, whatever the situation may be. Maybe you're a little more emotional as well. We're going to pick up on that, and we'll create a 2 to 4 minute session, which is similar to meditation, but more accessible. It'll include a bunch of different modalities like breath work, self-talk, things from sports psychology, things from neuroscience. And so you basically have a prescription for how to get back on track for that specific day.
Are there like teams or leagues that are kind of subscribing to this? Is this where some of this is taken from? Can you kind of take me through the genesis of getting here?
Yeah, the genesis of getting here. What we're trying to do is really bring to market technology and science that has really been either confined to the lab or really just with elite athletes, if they have a psych coach, or a neuro coach. Of course, that's only, the top 1% of the 1% are going to have that kind of capability. So what we have done, and there's definitely a personal backstory we can get into if there's interest, but what we've done is basically taken an evidence-based approach, working with a variety of scientists and advisors to translate what, the science around resilience training, which is about adding more cognitive load to the mind, like weight training, to adapt the mind to be more resilient. Techniques for recovery, within neuroscience and sports psychology that have been proven to, improve your state or get your body back into homeostasis. And we do it in such a way that is designed for the time crunch individual, because we're all super busy. And, you're not going to spend, in most cases, have the time to spend an hour meditating, or adding more responsibilities to your day. But if you can fit it in, as short as 2 minutes, and also have clarity on where you're at and track that over time, all those incremental gains will really add up.
Let me go back to one more part about this, and I do want to talk to you about your backstory and how this became important to you. But I want to ask one more thing, which is, like, of the things you mentioned tracking, like resting heart rate and blood pressure, and there's a lot of biometric stuff that can be tracked, and people can see wear and tear on muscles, bones, all these type of things that I think we're talking about as a total package of performance and training and bettering yourself. I'm still unclear. How do you track the brain? How do you track cognitive function? How do you track emotional wellness? Like, how does that come up in a score for you?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because, we're sort of paving the way, and it's not something people would intuitively get, like they might physical training or ice baths or things that are well established and understood. So what we do, again, straight out of science, what we do for the cognitive test, we use what's called a psychomotor diligence test, which is used in sleep studies in the military, highly correlative to cognitive fatigue. Basically, in simplistic terms, you spend about 60 seconds tapping the screen every time you see a shape. And it seems very straightforward, but we're tracking down to the millisecond. Your reaction time, we're looking at what we call lapses, which are moments when you lose attention. So if you have, let's say, 2 or 3 more lapses than you normally do, that's a bad sign. We track accuracy, and a bunch of other data points come out of just that simple interaction. So that's the cognitive side. And then on the emotional side, we're, as human beings, we're actually fairly good at subjectively understanding where we're at. But we take what's called a NASA TLX survey, which is basically used by NASA for astronaut readiness, highly correlative to your emotional readiness to perform. And so we're basically asking them on a calibrated scale, sort of, what their level of frustration is, what their ability to perform is in their own sort of self-assessment. And by looking at that over time, we can understand, like, if I'm, let's say, on a scale of 0 to 100, frustrated at 4, but I normally never say that I'm frustrated at all, 4 is actually a big deal for me, where it might not be for others. So it's very calibrated to the individual.
And then I assume that the 2 to 4 minute, for lack of a better way of putting it, meditation type services, that's kind of part of what you offer to people if it's deemed kind of necessary for the day?
Yeah. So what our system, if you spend the 90 seconds in the morning assessing your readiness, what our system will do then is create a series of automations based on what happens throughout the day. So we know your state in the morning. That context is super important. We'll give you a mindset session that's 2 to 4 minutes. And then throughout the day, if you've connected with, for instance, Strava, you go for a run. We know that, what your training load was. We'll then bring you back into the app and help you accelerate recovery. Near the end of the day, we may remind you if you had a bad night's sleep to take a session specifically to help you with sleep. So we'll really sort of help you manage the day once we get that initial context and then additional inputs that are automated.
Okay, let me go into your background. You'd referenced it earlier. You were an endurance athlete, and you then transitioned over into software and hardware development. Take me through your background. How did you end up here?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. Definitely a labor of love here. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, which is definitely a kind of one of the centers or hubs for endurance sports. Many professional triathletes and cyclists are there. And I got involved in bike racing at a very early age, worked my way up to an elite level in different off-road disciplines. And unfortunately, like many athletes, I suffered from injury and burnout, retired early at 26. A bit heartbroken, didn't feel like I truly reached my potential. And that kind of stuck with me. So that's definitely the thread that had me continuing to look at ways to improve, ways to unpack what went wrong, find new techniques from science to improve. And so as I transitioned out of sport to software and product management, I started building a lot of different products for consumers at scale, spent a lot of time at companies like AOL, worked for many Fortune 500 companies, building a lot of apps, a lot of consumer-facing products, and building high-performance teams. But meanwhile, I was still training, doing triathlon, doing some bike racing here and there. And basically, about 10 years ago, I went into kind of the focus on quantified self, where I was really measuring many data points every day. And ultimately, I found that HRV was very correlative to my adaptation to training. So I sort of put that into my toolkit, and I was like, this is a very reliable metric I can use. And this was before Whoop and Aura and many others started to use that metric. And then I started going deep into meditation. So it still felt like there was something missing. I signed a lifelong oath with the organization to not reveal any of the master secrets, and I spent 3 to 4 hours a day meditating. Ultimately, I found that lifestyle was causing its own level of stress, but I greatly appreciated mindfulness and the benefits that it garnered. And then the last piece was around resilience training. There was this science that came out in 2009 around kind of overloading the brain and creating an adaptation that would help with physical performance. And the second I heard it, I knew it was the thing. Like, I was so excited about it, and I kept waiting for it to come to market. It never did. There were many studies replicated, but it really just stayed confined to the lab. And one day I was on my bike trainer, and I had this epiphany for how it could be done. By then I had built a lot of skills, consumer-facing products, and in my mind, just like, this is a UI problem, which is, short for a user interface problem. Like, how do you translate what's in the lab and bring that to consumers in an accessible way? And I felt like I knew how to do it. In a couple of weeks, we built a prototype, cherry-picked my co-founders, and the rest is history, so to speak. But that's sort of the backstory.
That's cool. All right, one last thing, and I just want to ask kind of a broad question. When we talk about physical, exhaustion or all of the different things that can go along with performance that are physical, there are protocols that you can use to get someone better. And it may take time and it may happen quickly, but it can be done. When we're talking about cognitive and emotional, everybody's different. So how do you kind of think about helping someone perform in the cognitive emotional side when no two situations are going to be the same?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, we help eliminate that for the individual. So oftentimes it's a blind spot, as I was mentioning. So you may not recognize that your cognitive fatigue is impacting your motivation, impacting your ability to really, maybe you're trying to push some intervals, doing a HIIT session, you're wondering why you're not able to reach that. We're identifying those issues for you so you can be more aware. And then what our system does is it provides these personalized mindset sessions, as I mentioned, but what it also does is it tracks it subjectively and objectively so that we literally break down with each protocol. So let's say you do some breath work, you do some self-talk with specific messages, you do some visualization. At every one of those steps, we're tracking how your body responds to those protocols, so that when you look back at the results, you can say, hey, this actually helped me a lot, and this helped me a lot. And then you can go into our library and just sort of pick the things that were most helpful for you. And because we're showing you the data, there really aren't any other mindfulness apps that are going to tell you how well you meditated, but we're going to tell you how well this helped. And with that information, then you can self-select into the things that help you the most.
It's very interesting. Sachs is the CEO of Rewire Fitness. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a true pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
On the next Future Sport podcast, we deep dive into opportunity in the metaverse.
We went down that road of, hey, wouldn't it be amazing if you could own your own team, own your own stadium, be essentially the franchise owner, have a team that potentially could at least have some representation of gameplay.
That's Josh Newman, president at Melon, who shares visions of opportunity in the ever-expanding and new territory of the metaverse. That will do it for this episode. As always, the future is now. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein.